Fred Provenza. I'm retired. I used to work in a College of Natural Resources at Utah State University in Logan. 35 years there. Prior to that, I spent 7 years working on a ranch in Colorado while I was working as an undergrad in wildlife biology. Tomorrow, I'll be talking about mending broken linkages, and it'll be really focused on comparative food selection, nutrition, and health of livestock and human beings. It matters because we all eat, and our palates are linked to landscapes. And I think if we want to continue to survive and thrive as a species with other species on this planet, what we eat, how we produce that food is fundamentally important to our health and the health of the planet. Thank you, Aidan. Appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to be here with you one more time, if you don't run me out of this place after so long. But as Aidan said, we spent actually 35, 40 years studying food selection, nutrition, and health of goats, sheep, cattle, bison, elk, different species of animals. And when I retired, which I talked about yesterday, started working on this book, Nourishment, and I was really interested in human food selection, nutrition, and health, and trying to read in the literature on human beings, what kind of studies do humans do, and are there parallels with the kind of studies that we were doing over the years? And so this presentation today is really meant to, as reflections, talking about some of the work we did over the years, but then trying, and no offense to you really true nutritionists, human nutritionists here in the audience, but trying to just think about, well, you know, do people study things like we studied? And if they do, what did they learn about it? So that's where I'm going to go here today. And I want to start off simply by pointing out something that's really plain as can be. Nobody has to tell wild creatures what to eat or how to reproduce. They know how to do that. They don't need authorities to tell them one thing. They're really good at doing those kind of things. Even the lowly laboratory rat, when challenged with different kinds of deficiencies, is quite able to rectify those deficits if it's given appropriate choices. And they can even, if you render them diabetic, they'll select a diet that deals with the diabetes. So pretty sharp, huh? But then consider the irony. We're constantly being, and this is going to sound like I'm being really critical, but it's not. It's just we're constantly being told, bombarded with information about what we should eat, what we shouldn't eat, never-ending stream of that. And so you wonder then, you know, do we lack nutritional wisdom? Don't we have any of that anymore? Have we lost that as a species? Or has it been hijacked? That's a question that I want to talk about as I go along. You know, we started out, I did all my work on the ranch and on rangeland kind of situations where animals are faced with, you know, at a minimum 50 choices, probably 100, 150, 200 different plant species that they can select from. Those species, they differ tremendously in terms of their nutrient content, energy, protein, vitamins, minerals, not only from species to species, but from plant part to plant part. They're hugely differentiated. And not only these primary compounds, but the secondary compounds that we talked about, those will change from species to species, from morning to afternoon, from day to day, seasonally. So there's a tremendous amount of challenge out there in those environments. So the question we were interested in starting off was, do domestic animals have nutritional wisdom? And if so, how does that work? How does that work? Well, my real introduction to this in a big way was when I moved to Utah and went to down in the St. George area, a little town called Gunlock. My wife and I were way out in the boonies, living in the sticks and working with goats. And the idea was to use these goats during the winter to browse this shrub blackbrush. And browsing during the winter stimulates new growth on these plants. And people had used goats down in that country, and they winter cattle on that country. You may not believe it, and that may not look like a match, but it's incredible to see how well cattle can do browsing down in those landscapes. It was really an eye-opener to me. So we're working with the goats and we're working with cattle and working with the ranchers. But the thing that was amazing, so that shrub there in the middle of the slide that's got all that kind of reddish looking growth, that's all new growth on blackbrush after we had the goats down there for a winter. The amazing thing was, though, that the goats didn't want to eat that new growth. So even though the new growth was higher in energy, protein, minerals, the goats strongly preferred the old growth to the new growth. So what's up with that? When I went back to campus and started telling some of the nutritionists there and the toxicologists, they looked at me and they said, well, Sonny, that just goes to show that domestic animals don't have nutritional wisdom. And that was the feeling really pretty much across the board with people in academia at that time, because the idea was that, okay, certainly wild animals still must have nutritional wisdom. How else could they select diets that help them to thrive and reproduce? But as a result of domestication, of 10,000 years of domestication, cattle, sheep, and goats had lost their ability. So it didn't make sense to me, but I didn't know what to say at the time. I didn't know what to say I didn't know why the goats weren't eating the new growth and what was what. So that's a food for thought for you of, do domestic animals have nutritional wisdom? And if so, how does that work? I have one other food for thought for you. I mentioned that we got involved in bison and working with Ted Turner's and his ranches over the years. And I'm going to wind back around to this food for thought at the very end. But let me read you something. It comes from this book, The Buffalo Harvest, that was written by Frank Meyer. He was out west after the Civil War, killing bison, basically. You know, he thought he was going to get rich killing bison. And so this little short book is his account of what it was like across a 6-state region during that time, what they were encountering and what it was like hunting bison. It's really interesting. But he says here, he says, do you remember reading about buffalo herds millions strong, moving in a solid mass and stopping trains and wagons? Of course, the herd, this vast mass of animals, would be under the leadership of a grand old buffalo bull who'd trot serenely at its head, issuing orders and demanding instant and complete obedience. He says, isn't that about the picture as you have it in your mind? And I think for most of us, we do have this idea of these massive, massive herds of bison going across these landscapes. But he goes on to say, if that's a picture, get it out of your head fast, because the fact is no buffalo herd I saw ever numbered over 200 animals, and most of them were very much smaller. Most of the herds would run from 3 to 60 animals with an average of around 15, 20 animals. In these small groups, the buffalo traveled and fed, scattered over the plains, but each one separate and apart from the other herds. Whenever they stampeded, sure enough, they came together and charged as one vast solid herd. But when the fright had passed, they'd separate into the peculiar small herd formation. He says, do keep these small herds in mind. They were important to us in our hunting. In fact, they formed the basis for our attack. So that's the question. What was the basis for their attack? What are these little small herds and what's the basis for their attack? Any of you remember Cheers? I'm going to read you one theory here on it. So Cliff discusses the buffalo harvest while visiting with Norm over a few beers in this TV show Cheers, huh? And he says, well, you see, Norm, it's like this. A herd of buffalo can only move as fast as the slowest buffalo. And when the herd is hunted, it's the lowest and weakest ones at the back that are killed first. This natural selection is good for the herd as a whole because the general speed and health of the whole group keeps improving by regular killing of the weakest members. In much the same way, the human brain can only operate as fast as the slowest brain cells. Now, as we know, excessive intake of alcohol kills brain cells. In this way, regular consumption of beer eliminates the weaker brain cells, making the brain a faster and more efficient machine. And that, Norm, is why you always feel smarter after a few beers, huh? So that's not really where I'm going to go with this. But so yesterday I mentioned really quickly that there were three legs to this stool so far as we came to understand it. And I know we probably don't just know a little bit about it, but there were 3 legs to this stool of nutritional wisdom. And if you break any one of those legs, it's not going to be manifest. If you break all 3 legs, which sometimes we inadvertently do with livestock, and I think we've done with the human diet. We've broken all three of those legs. It's no wonder that we have a lot of issues. And so I want to talk about each of those legs and try to allude to, we did so much, I want to say, in that Behave program over 10 years, so much practical work with ranchers and farmers. We were working on the ground all 10 of those years, all students working with one another. And so I'll allude to some of that work, but there's not time to go into all the things we did with each one of these legs of the stool, but that's what we were doing. So the first is these flavor feedback relationships, and then I'll talk about the importance of variety and satiety, and then I'll talk about the social cultural parts of that. So start off this idea of more than a matter of taste. If I were to ask you why you like a particular food, odds are you'd tell me because it tastes good, right? And if I were to ask you why you don't like a particular food, odds are you'd tell me because it tastes bad, right? And that's, in one way, it's as simple as that. It's absolutely as simple as that. There's such tremendous complexity. When you eat a meal, tens of thousands of compounds of these new primary and secondary compounds as folks are introduced into the body. And when you look, and I'm not going to get into this, but we've studied it a lot, and I've read a lot about it, and how all those relationships are mediated by neuropeptides, neurotransmitters, hormones. It's amazingly complex, but in the end, it's as simple as, does it taste good or doesn't it taste good? And if people are eating wholesome foods, it pretty much boils down to that, but there's all these levels then of complexity that underlie that. And so that's what we got into as we went along in the program, is trying to understand some of those levels of complexity. And this notion of feedback is simply that when an animal eats a food, cells and organ systems in the body, if you think about where food goes ultimately, if it's not excreted, it's going to go to cells. And what we were learning is that these organ systems in the body, including the microbiome, are feeding back to change liking for the flavor of food. That was it, and it's being mediated by these primary and secondary compounds. So let me try to illustrate that a little bit. When I was told domestic animals don't have nutritional wisdom, and I'd been observing things that didn't fit with that, I would sit around with other grad students and some faculty members who didn't buy that, and we would brainstorm, well, how can you prove that palatability is more than a matter of taste, that there is a wisdom that underlies that? That's what we would think about. How are you going to demonstrate that? And the best way we came up with is like this. And we did it with goats, we did it with sheep, we did it with cattle, but I'm going to illustrate it with sheep. And we would make the animals mildly deficient in a nutrient. And I'll show you all the ones we worked with over time, but we'd make them mildly deficient, not strongly, just mildly deficient. And then we would offer them a food that didn't contain that nutrient. I'm going to illustrate this with straw, so I'm going to use straw as the example. So on odd days, animals in group 1, we'd give them a meal of straw in the morning, and the straw was flavored with apple. That's the cue, right? So they've got apple-flavored straw. Animals in group 2, same meal, but they get maple-flavored straw. Now, after that, we would take a stomach tube and put it directly into the gut and put a quart of water in their gut. Now, that only makes sense in relation to what we do on the even days. Now, we switch the flavors so that the animals in group 1 that got apple, followed by a gavage of water, now they get maple, and now they get that water, but that water's containing the nutrient that they're lacking. Does that make sense? Going directly into the gut. Or we did infusions into the veins, we did a bunch of things like that. And the animals in group 2 now, they get apple. Then we simply give them a choice between apple and maple flavored straw and look at which one they prefer. Now, if they're associating the flavor of the food with feedback from the nutrient that they're lacking, animals in group 1 should prefer maple. Does that make sense? And animals in group 2 should prefer apple. And the first time we ran that study, it was stunning to walk down that row of 24 sheep, and you knew absolutely, looking at the 2 food boxes, which treatment they were in, because one food box was empty, the other hadn't been touched. Now, I want to illustrate that We used to do short courses over the years, and we would have people doing some of the working hands-on with animals. And this next slide is simply showing you, these are sheep that it's first thing in the morning. One group of sheep has been drenched with the nutrient that they were lacking when they were eating straw. The other group of sheep was simply drenched with water. And you can see for yourself what that looks like. So you can see two things from that. One's the high-tech facilities that we had at Utah State University. We were a low-budget operation. And two, one group loves it, the other group can't figure out why they want it, right? We did that over and over. We've probably gavaged and did this to more animals than anybody on the planet. But, you know, that's what we would see over and over and over and over again. Now, we started with energy, and I used to get a kick out of this quote because I used to think Dave Barry really got it if he adds the feedback term here. He says, what are calories? He says, calories are little units that measure how good a particular food tastes. Fudge, for example, has a great many calories, whereas celery, which is not really a food at all, but a member of the plywood family, provided by Mother Nature so we have a way to get onion dip into our mouths at parties, has none, huh? Add the feedback part, and that's exactly it. Here's where I'm going to make a long story really, really short. We worked in so many ways. You know, the idea was these ruminants are walking compost heaps. How are they ever going to get feedback signals? And we did not find that at all. I could go on so long about all the nuance that was in there on things that surprised us, that we didn't know we were doing, that were happening. You know, if you had some food as a part of the basal diet that could interfere with what you were doing, it was just over and over again. But we started with energy. We looked at energy in a variety of different forms, from cellulose and starch to glucose and volatile fatty acids. We went on to work with protein, non-protein nitrogen, ruminally degraded protein, bypass protein. We looked at ratios of energy to protein, rates at which they ferment relative to one another. Over and over again, the animals were sensitive to that, and it was always as a function of need, of physiological state if they were pregnant versus lactating, if they had a parasite load versus not a parasite load. Always it was a function of what they needed. We went on to work with minerals and to show that they could discriminate different minerals as a function of need. Our colleagues in Australia have gone on to work with vitamins like vitamin E. So we did a lot of work with the primary compounds. We were also working with the secondary compounds, these major classes of compounds that Andrea and Mike were talking about yesterday. And, you know, at the time we started that work, there was a lot of work in ecology that was done. And looking at these, and they were primarily viewed as defenses, plant defenses against herbivory. But what really became clear to us is what Paracelsus said ages ago, the father of toxicology, said everything is a toxin. There's nothing that is not a toxin. It all depends on the dose. And that was absolute. You can take any one of those primary compounds and you can make animals really sick on it. We could create strong food aversions just by giving them too much, dosing them with too much. But what we came to find out with these secondary compounds is that in modest amounts, they like them. Animals like those. So it became very complex at a point where you realized it's the interrelationship between these primary and secondary compounds that's mediating all these interactions, and that's what the body is integrating ultimately. It's not just primary, not just secondary. It's the total integration of that. And food becomes, in this broader context, not just individual foods, But whether or not an animal, and I'll try to give you a flavor of this, will eat a particular food, you may think that food's horrible. But if it has an appetizer of another food, it might really like that food. So it became we could see it became very nuanced and complex. And then there was the whole medicine part of things, and we got into that. So let me say a couple of words here. First, why did the goats not eat the new twigs of blackbrush? They're 80% condensed tannin, and they're condensed tannin. You know, tannins aren't tannins. They're all different. And this particular condensed tannin is very, very potent for most goats. They don't like to eat it because it's bad for them. So the goats were a step ahead of us, right? They knew that this stuff isn't good for us. So that was one part. Then there's the medicine part that we got into. And there's really, if you think about it, there's two ways that animals can self-medicate. One is therapeutically, the other is prophylactically. Let me just take a minute for each of those. From a therapeutic standpoint, and I took this last night by Scott's house, so you know what it's like out there where he's living. I won't say how Scott and Stefan were by that time last night, but anyway. No. So we did a lot of work on those kind of things. And again, I'm making a long story short, but animals can figure out when they get sick, if they have appropriate choices, they can figure out how to rectify that. That's the bottom line. They can figure out how to feel better when they're sick. And when they learn different medicines and different illnesses, they become like we do. If you have a headache, you don't select something that fixes your stomach, you take an aspirin. So we showed that they were able to do all those kind of things using these different things. For sake of time, I'm simply not going to get into that. But even the internal parasites, we were doing a lot of work. And rather than look for silver bullets, you know, ivermectin and some of the drugs that we use nowadays, there's becoming huge resistance to those. And there was this movement then toward, well, let's look at the secondary compounds. And then it's kind of the silver bullet approach again. Let's just focus on tannins because tannins have an effect. But some of our colleagues, and we were on this same page, were saying, you know, no, it's the mixture of these. And if you get tannins and terpenes in the diet, you have a bigger effect than if not. So anyway, this idea of that animals can self-medicate if they learn to do it. And the first things we did were in feedlots and just looking at animals that are on high-grain diets and acidosis and showing they'll select sodium bicarb or bentonite to relieve the acidosis. So anyway, we did a lot of work like that. But there's also this prophylactic part, and as different people were talking yesterday and talking about diversity of plants and the value of diversity, I was thinking how important that is, what people were saying. And I was also thinking about my experience of following animals around back in the ranch days and then in early days of studies. And back in those days, I had the idea, if we could understand food selection well enough, we'd be able, like the physicists, to predict what animals are going to eat. But I'd be following them around, and you'd notice they'd eat 50, 75 species, and you'd think, you know, how are you ever going to, you know, how's that? That's not going to work. It was missing the point. But in those days when we were doing the studies, you'd see 3 to 5 plants would make up the bulk of the diet on these really diverse landscapes. But there'd be, as I say, another 50 to 75, and we discounted those. I don't anymore. I think that's probably the most important part of it from medicating prophylactically. They're exposing cells in their body. You know, you think a cell can only forage on what's in those capillaries, right? If you think of it as a stream, that's all the cell has available to it. Well, if it's got a wide array of these secondary compounds, and that's, I think, what's coming out of the human literature, is that those cells can utilize compounds that are in the diet that you may not even be thinking about for their own health. That's how I look at it. And I think that all those species that weren't such a big part of the diet were probably very, very, very important in terms of health of those animals. So let me turn to humans. When I got into the literature and tried to see, well, you know, what's known about humans? Have people done a lot of studies of flavor feedback relationships? A little bit of literature, not a huge literature out there. and certainly hasn't been looked at in the sense that I'm talking about here of all these kind of relationships does not exist. But when you look in some of the anthropological literature, you find really good evidence and very interesting kind of accounts of people becoming deficient, everything from scurvy to mineral deficits to salt to cod liver oil. I'm going to come back to that here later in the talk. Craving for fat on lean meat diets. Just over and over again, there are really neat accounts that show, sure, our bodies have that ability, and we know what we need when we get in those conditions, and if we have suitable foods available, we can do that. That's what came to me. But every time I watch that video of those sheep, I think of what the food industry has done with processed foods. That's absolutely what I think about, because you know, straw, it's not that great, right? Not that great of a food. It's okay, but it's not. And that's what, to me, the food industry is doing. You link familiar flavors with refined carbs to lure people to a novel food by dressing it in a known and liked flavor, and then you reinforce it with a blast of energy, which is what we did in that thing there, and you form powerful preferences for those kind of foods. Target kids to change the dietary habits of a culture. And that's been done systematically around the world, actually. You can read about that in that literature, and you think, okay. Another thing related to humans, and I'll jump back to our animal studies and forward to these. We did so many studies that showed what you supplement an animal with influences the choices it makes when it goes out to forage on pasture, or if it's out on pastures or rangelands. From, you know, if you feed high protein in the barn to dairy cattle, when they go out to forage on clover grass pastures, it changes selection of foods. They don't eat so much clover. They don't eat the most protein rich. Why? They've already met their needs for protein. So do you want to feed that in the barn? The recommendation was no, you don't need to on pasture-based systems. We did work with these secondary compounds too, where we would have plants like bird's foot trefoil, alfalfa, and fescue. Those are the secondary compounds they have, and if we gave them a capsule of tannins and then turned them out to forage, they'd avoid the trefoil, eat the alfalfa and the fescue, and the same with these other ones. Some other groups did some work showing that if you deworm animals, they're going to eat less of the medicinal plants that are out there in their pasture. So a lot of things you get realizing and thinking about relative to how what we do may alter selection in ways that we really wouldn't want to alter selection out there on pastures. So I thought a lot about, does fortifying, and you know, you take and process a food, as Andrew said yesterday, you remove all the good parts actually, and then you use that as the basis. Does fortifying and enriching foods decrease preference for wholesome foods? And there's a bit of a literature that's out there from a human standpoint on that. Not a huge literature, but there's a bit. And in the book, I reviewed some of that. And I would often think, based on accounts of 18th century sailors that were becoming deficient in vitamin C, and powerful accounts of their cravings, their strong cravings, and when they'd hit land, what they would start to just devour these foods. So they craved these fruits and vegetables. Their bodies knew what they needed. Well, today, just as an example, those sailors could drink vitamin C fortified fruit drinks, their scurvy disappear along with their craving for fruits and vegetables, right? We're doing things that we're not eating. Kids don't eat their vegetables. Kids don't eat their fruits. Well, part of the reason is because the quality of those isn't so great, but another reason is that we may be supplementing with things that are decreasing liking for that. And rather than eat a rich array of phytochemicals, sailors consume a large quantity of sugar-sweetened calories. So there's two kind of cravings, and when you read about this, you know, what we studied was cravings for wholesome foods. And as I'm saying, there's a bit of especially in the anthropological literature on humans, but what it's really about is refined carbs and addiction to sugar and, you know, the kind of things that happens with that. So I'll conclude just by saying, like this lady said, inside me is a thin woman crying to get out. I usually shut the bitch up with a piece of chocolate, which we learned yesterday is a nutrient, right? It's an essential nutrient. Okay, so from flavor feedback then, just a bit on that. You know, obviously this gets into cafeteria mineral supplements and is it worth doing that, and a whole bunch of practical things that we worked with people on that I'm not, for the sake of time, getting into that. So this whole idea then of the spice of life and variety, and why do animals do these, why is the grass always greener on the other side of the pasture? And really when you see that, or you see animals eating bones or licking soil, they're telling us something. That's what, if I had the time, I would go over and over the kind of things we saw when we were working with animals. But they're really telling us something when they're doing these kind of things. So we got into this whole idea of variety and the roles that these primary and secondary compounds play. And you know, when you look in the ecological literature, there's 3 explanations for why do animals eat a variety of foods. Is one, that no one primary compound can meet all of their needs, not only for energy and protein, but for minerals and vitamins and so forth. So the only way to do that is to eat a variety of foods. The second explanation has to do with these secondary compounds, and it's really an important one. The idea is that secondary compounds set a limit on how much of any one food that an animal can eat. And in doing that, then animals eat a variety of foods that contain different kinds of secondary compounds, and that doesn't swamp detoxification systems inside the body. So it becomes a really functional way, not only to meet nutrients, but to self-medicate preventatively, basically. And so we looked at these kind of things and relationships between these primary and secondary compounds. And that's what I mentioned yesterday. To me, the more we went along in our work, I could see the value of plant diversity and what that does for health, not only for creatures above ground, but, you know, to me, it's, as I said yesterday, plants turn dirt into soil and soil into homes for herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores below and above ground. It just creates health in those systems. And so I've come to see that as so important. And then I think about relationships that animals figured out when they were able to have a diversity of plants. We did a bunch of work with plants like endophyte infected tall fescue. And we were learning that if there's bird's foot trefoil in those swards, that sheep and cattle both can learn that an appetizer of bird's foot trefoil helps the endophyte infected tall fescue go down. They eat way more fescue when they have an appetizer of trefoil. And we feel pretty comfortable that that's because those tannins in the trefoil are binding up those alkaloids in the fescue. And so rather than those alkaloids getting absorbed and having their adverse effects, they're bound up, and that tannin alkaloid complex ends up in the feces. We were seeing the same sort of things when we were working with plants like bitterbrush and sagebrush. Sagebrush is such a dominant plant in the Great Basin, and where that co-occurs with bitterbrush, there's some animals have figured out, not all of them, and I think I've got this as a story later on, that sheep in particular, I'm thinking now that an appetizer of bitterbrush helps them to eat significant more sagebrush than animals that don't do that. So it's those kind of relationships that animals start to figure out when there's diversity and when you have culture as a part of your system. And that's why I was saying, you know, it's the relationships between these primary and secondary compounds, and then what animals figure out on how to utilize a landscape. And that becomes then what it means for animals to be locally adapted to a landscape and to know how to utilize that landscape. You can take a naive animal, it may not be nearly as productive on that landscape because it doesn't have the knowledge of how to utilize those resources. So we got involved in a lot of work like that, and we started working with these shepherds in France because they were really all about those same kind of things. And as I mentioned yesterday, they'll look across a landscape and everything from first rate to disgusting, and they don't think, well, we're just going to use the first rate. They think about how do we set up sequences throughout the day so that they utilize all of those plants, and utilizing the same kind of thought process that I'm talking about here. These grazing circuits enable individuals to regulate intake of primary and secondary compound. I'm going to really make a point of that in a second. They can stimulate appetite too, because animals are the complementarities I'm talking about. And then they used it to target graze to enhance and maintain biodiversity. Let me come back to this individuality and just make a point. No two individuals are alike. We know for us, every one of us is so different. We can be identified by our fingerprint. A bloodhound can track us by our odors. If you look inside, we're equally different in terms of form and function. I'll come back to that. But over and over again in our studies, we were documenting what do individual animals do, not what does the average animal do, what do individuals do. So here's a study we ran with lambs over a couple-month period, giving them free choice barley and alfalfa. And you have everything from animal number 1 there that wants very little barley and strongly prefers alfalfa, all the way over to 24, strongly prefers the barley, doesn't want so much alfalfa. All of them are gaining at the same rate. They're all doing really well, but it's simply that every individual is different. Now, I'm going to very quickly here say we followed this up. So what's a practical implication of that? We were thinking about animals in feedlots, and we were working with cattle, and we were feeding them over a 2-month period. And we had one group that was given the ingredients, free choice, the ingredients in a total mixed ration. The other was forced to eat the total mixed ration. That was the only choice. And then we looked at, well, how much food do they eat? How well did they gain weight? What was the feed efficiency? When we killed them, what did their carcasses look like? They all did really well, but the key thing was the animals given a choice ate significantly less food throughout that 2-month trial. They were able to better meet their needs as an individual level compared to when they were offered a one-size-fits-all for the average individual, because there is no average. Every one of them selected a different diet. No individual selected the same food from day to day, but each individual selected a diet that met its need. So cost-wise, it was really significant, the reduction in how much money it cost to feed those animals out. So we're seeing implications like that. The goats, I said that they don't want to eat current season's growth. Well, that was true for 80% of them, but 20% had never heard a word I said. They loved the current season's growth. So then you start to think about, well, you know, can you select for animals that can utilize the landscape that you have? You know, and we worked with people that had animals on end-of-fight infected tall fescue, and over years, that's what they had done, is selected for animals that had the ability to better utilize that. Out west, larkspur is one of the most costly of the poisonous plants, and they were doing work at the Poisonous Plants Lab looking at different breeds of animals. 5 different breeds. The key point here is there's more variation within a breed than there is among breeds. So that's a tremendous variation among individuals that talking about. And this book here, Biochemical Individuality, written by Roger Williams years and years and years ago, probably in the 50s, he just nailed it. He went through study after study after study, and he was concluding, you know, every individual is different. There's a wisdom in the body. And he said, really what it boils down to, if people are on wholesome diets, you really don't need nutritionists. And he was a nutritional biochemist, but he was recognizing the importance of this kind of thing. I shouldn't take the time to tell this joke, but I can't resist. I haven't told it in ages and ages, and so I'll tell it. You're close to these people in Montana. You're just a state away. But I have really good friends there in Montana. One's named David Mannix, and I did a workshop for Ranching for Profit, and he came up to me after that and he said, I got to tell you a story about this individuality. And he said, I was doing a tour. I was going on tour of ranches, and I was there early to this one ranch, and it's a crusty old rancher, really crusty old guy. And so I was there and trying to visit with him. I didn't know what to say. So what do you talk about when you don't know what the heck to talk about? The weather, right? So he said, I made the mistake asking this guy, so what's a normal year like around here? And the guy gave him a dirty look, like, you know, what, are you an idiot or what? He said, no such thing as a normal year here, Sonny. He says, let me ask you a question. What's the average person like? He says, I'll tell you. The average person has 1 breast and 1 testicle, but you don't see many of them running around here, do you, Sonny? And that's the end of the story, but I don't think you just, that's such a key point. It's such a key point. And I actually didn't have these slides in here. And then Scott and Stefan were saying, you really need to hit that point tomorrow. So, okay. So, but we saw that over and over again to the point where in all the papers we would write, we would make a point of all the individual variation, not just that the means were different in our treatment groups, because that's where the action is in all this stuff. So going back to humans then, and I talked about this yesterday, so I'll kind of move through it quickly, but as we've gone over time, we've moved from landscapes where really people are encountering a tremendous amount of biochemical richness. And as people pointed out yesterday too, throughout the day, that really morphed into modern foodscapes where yield has trumped biochemical richness. And Mark Shaxter, who was here last year with all of you, I know, he wrote this good book, The Dorito Effect. And as he points out, that there's two ways that the foods have changed over time. The flavors of meat and produce have become blander. At the same time, processed foods have become all the more irresistible. And in Dorito Effect, he really goes into how all that's happened and how the food system has been hijacked, how our liking has been hijacked. So as he points out, we've disincentivized real foods because they don't taste good, and we've made junk food all the more desirable, and we've ended up in really some issues with overeating, obesity, diabetes, diet-related kind of diseases. So yesterday I was just talking about how resource availability affects soils and soil health, affects plant diversity and chemistry, and I made the point that the quality of foods has declined, just as Mark is pointing out, and that's due both to the conditions under which we grow the foods, which with other people had pointed out nicely, and the varieties we've selected for. And then I talked about how biodiversity and chemistry influences biochemical richness of the diets of animals, and how that has downstream effects on quality of milk, cheese, and meat. And everybody from Tom, the first speaker, right on through to most people made the point that we acknowledge that that's important. And when you talk with people who, we had a milk cow when I was on the ranch, and which pasture that cow was on, what it was eating, we knew that was going to affect the flavor of the milk and the cheese the ricotta cheese that we were making. And if we really wanted to impress somebody, we knew which pasture we should put them on, right? We knew the mix, we knew that stuff. So it's known, but when you look in the science literature, not so much is known, and especially as then would tie in with the human health parts. And the same is true for meat, like I was talking about yesterday. We don't know so much about how phytochemical richness of the diet not only affects flavor, but quality, satiety, and human health. We focus on things like omega-3s and omega-6s and CLAs, but we know there's much more to that story that needs to be explored. And that's what Stefan and Scott and myself are really interested in trying to pursue these broader roles, as I talked about yesterday. So for sake of time, I won't reiterate that. I made the point yesterday, our understanding of human health is based on 150 nutritional components, but there's 26,000 of these different kind of things that are probably important in health. And so trying to take that broader look at that through metabolomics, through trials that work with people under conditions, we think that's a really important thing to get behind what is quality of food and where does quality of food come from the soil, through the plant diversity, right on through to the animals and the humans. I mentioned that paper yesterday titled Food, Not Nutrients, the Basic Unit in Nutrition, and it just, over and over again to me, that strikes as really, really true. As you go to individual compound, for instance, you can take a clove of garlic and it's got a tremendous number of compounds in it, hundreds and hundreds of compounds. When you buy a garlic capsule, and I mean you can buy odorless garlic capsules, what value could that have? If you can't breathe on somebody and knock them over, there's nothing happening with that garlic. Then to rich combinations of foods, I just think there's so much that's important to that. So we've extracted the compound from the food from the diet, and the diet from the culture, and now we're kind of in a pickle. And it's the culture that I want to talk about last here in the presentation, this social cultural part of things, and the transgenerational linkages to landscapes. Here's a picture of the old rancher I mentioned that became like a father to me, he and his wife, and my wife, Henry DeLuca. And we used to talk a lot about what does it mean for an animal to know the range? And he had so many stories from his years of experience of bringing animals that didn't know those rangelands. That's where we used to graze cattle there on the bottom, Mount Shavana in the background, and we'd go clear up into those mountains. And he'd tell stories. If I bring animals in here that don't know the range, it's a mess. It ends up being a wreck. For us personally, in terms of when we go up to move them from one place to the next, even knowing where we're going to find them, reproductive rates go down. So he had story after story after story. And when I think of the work that our group did over the years, it was really about what does it mean to know the range? That's really what it all boiled down to. And so think about, how mother becomes a link to landscapes from ancestors through mothers to the offspring and to the landscape. And it's not surprising when you look in the ecological literature how much people have come to appreciate that these natal experiences influence food and habitat selection. That little mountain bluebird there, when Sue and I were living in the backwoods, and you come to realize that if you put a band on those bluebirds, now you've named it, you can recognize that bird. They come back to the same place, to the same nest. Why do they do that? It's the home field advantage in life, right? We recognize how important it is in sports, but when you think of that in life, of knowing what and what not to eat, where and where not to go, what's a predator, what's not a predator, they learn all these things. It's not just in their DNA, they're learning about those relationships. So the culture becomes such an important part of all that's going on. So it wasn't hard for us to show these lifelong experiences that start in utero. The fetal taste system is fully functional during the last trimester of gestation. So the foods that mom's eating are getting into the amniotic fluid. The young's already starting to learn about food in the environment. What's familiar? What's becoming familiar to it? After birth, flavors get into mother's milk. Those are also cues to food. And then mother as a model. So we weren't having trouble to show those things because that's such an important part. It was easy to demonstrate experimentally. We did so many studies, it would take, an hour just to go through the studies. But one I'll mention because of it shows the power in this stuff. It was a 3-year trial, and we had animals that were, during this trial, we were working with cows. They were 5 to 8 years of age, started out at 5, 8 years by the time it was over. And half of the animals on this study had been exposed as calves to straw, ammoniated straw, which was the bulk of the diet that was being fed from December through May. The other half of the calves had never seen straw. Throughout all 3 years of that study, those calves that had that experience, now, key point, they had that experience early in life. They didn't see straw again until they were 5 years old. And now throughout all 3 years of that study, they had higher body weight and condition. They produced more milk. They had shorter postpartum intervals when they were fed that diet. Now, each year the differences got a little less, but even by the 3rd year, they were still statistically significant differences. That had a powerful kind of effect. We went on to work with calves exposed in utero to straw. And we were showing that those calves that had that experience, they ate more straw, they digested the straw better. They had higher digestible dry matter intakes, and they grew faster than calves not exposed to straw. So I used to think about, okay, if you're winter grazing, and that's what we were interested in really, if you're winter grazing, do those experiences, can you build a herd of cattle that really is better adapted to utilizing the forages that you have, the poor quality forages during winter? And all this was showing that, yeah, you can, that the bodies are changing as a function of the experience. Our colleagues in Australia did that same kind of work with saltbrush. They have areas dominated by saltbrush, and they were showing lambs exposed to saltbrush in utero grow faster, handle a salt load better than lambs from mothers on pastures, and that the kidney form and function had changed. They were looking at organ function. and they showed they excrete salt more rapidly, they actually drink less water, and they maintain higher intake when eating saltbrush. So I could go on and on and on. The last example here I alluded to, learn patterns of behavior and enable experienced animals to better forage. This was work that was done at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station, and they wanted to identify sheep that could eat a lot of sagebrush on their landscape. So they were using fecal analyses to look at which sheep are eating the most sagebrush. And they found a subgroup that was eating a huge amount of sagebrush, and we all thought it was physiological changes that had occurred within those sheep, and that can happen. But what they found was that those sheep were using bitterbrush as an appetizer to eat more sagebrush. That's what they were all doing. And it wasn't the whole flock, though. Do you see? It wasn't the 6,000 sheep. It was 500 sheep that had figured that out, and it had become a part of that subculture on the place. That's what I would see over and over again when we were working with the animals, is that certain animals figure certain things out, and that becomes a really important subgroup that a person can build on, and that's what had happened there. So to sum up, this is it. Therefore, after a 40 years of doing this, it's my contention that couch potatoes actually begin to develop early in life as tater tots. That's it, you know. And there is a really rich literature in the humans on this sort of thing, and I've gotten to know some of the people that do that work. There's a lady named Julie Manella at Manella Institute of Chemical Senses who, anytime I hear on the radio, they start to talk about something that's happening in utero or mother's milk, and I know they're going to be interviewing Julie because she's doing that research, showing how experiences in utero, experiences with mother's milk, and so forth. There's a really neat literature that just shows the same things we were studying in these other animals. I think one of the more interesting studies that I came across, and it's going to match right up with that total mixed ration versus free choice I was telling you about here earlier, was done by a lady named Clara Davis back in the 1920s, nearly a century ago. And she was working in orphanages with kids that were given up for adoption. And in this particular study, she had 15 children that they followed for 6 years. And throughout all 6 years of that study, those kids were given a choice of these 34 foods, not all of them simultaneously, but they were allowed the free choice. And they recorded what every kid ate on every day throughout 6 years of that study. They had pediatricians working with them. And what they found was that and I've read the journal articles, the pediatrician said we never saw a healthier bunch of kids. The kids were in great health. When they'd come into those studies deficient, for instance, with rickets, and they had choice to get cod liver oil, they would really eat a lot of cod liver oil, foods like that. And then as their deficiency subsided, they'd cut back. But the point that she made that was so much what we saw, it was almost like we plagiarized her work when we were writing our paper. She said, no two children ever selected the same diet. No child ever selected the same food from day to day, but every child selected the diet that met its needs. You know, it was like no different from the cows. So she concludes the results leave the selection of the foods to be made available to young children in the hands of their elders, where everyone has always known that it belongs. And she had become the culture for those kids, right? I can't help but say this. I know friends now who send me pictures, and I should send you. They doing Clara Davis kind of things with their kids, you know, rather than just, they give them choices of stuff, and then they'll send me accounts of what the kid does from day to day and so forth. They're kind of repeating this. But, you know, that hasn't been the case. As we know, the choices people learn to make now are influenced by corporate, political and academic elders. We've lost those linkages. And so we end up with a lot of issues that are, I think, in many ways processed food related. We have transgenerational metabolic syndrome. And, you know, again, there's a rich literature. Mothers who gain excessive weight during pregnancy, mothers who are obese, mothers who become diabetic during pregnancy are more likely to have fatter babies with higher incidence of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and so forth. So there's a rich literature about what's happening and how that affects form and function. A key point in all of this, I think, is that genes aren't destiny. Genes are being expressed as a function of the interaction with the environment. So this whole field of epigenetics that's just ballooned in the last 10, 15 years has become so relevant. And so you can look, and we did. You can look at what's happening neurologically, enhanced neural response to familiar olfactory cues. We were looking at rumen development and rumen function and kidney function and so forth. All these kind of things become really important. This book here, just very quickly, A Change of Heart, it really illustrates how organ systems are influencing liking for food. This lady here was one of the first people to have organ transplants, and she had a heart and lung transplant. And this book is an account of what that's like, the experience of that. It's a fascinating book. But what she talks about a lot is how her food preferences broadened out to include what her organ donor gave. So things that she never liked at all, like hot peppers and chicken McNuggets or whatever it was, she came to like those a great deal as a function of that organ transplant. So it's showing these organs are feeding back, right? They're playing a role in altering our liking. And the brain has certain needs, the heart, the lung, the liver, all those organs, the microbiome are all feeding back. So our ancestors, our mothers, ourselves, when I learned you are what you eat, I realized I was nuts, huh? One of the things that I think differs, we didn't study this in goats or sheep or cattle, is food hexing and the power, what I refer to as food hexing and the power of beliefs. And I'm not saying this in any way that to be critical. I know the same things happen to me, but what's amazing is the power of what we come to believe, and the power of our experiences early in life to influence what we can even perceive, how we even see anything, and then what we believe. And it's in everything, but it's really, really in foods. And I think that's part of the reason why it's not all of it, but it's part of the reason why human nutrition is so confusing. So let me just elaborate on that a little bit. You can think just cholesterol, gluten, fat. Think about how much advice has changed on that over the years, right? And still changing. And so it becomes very confusing for people. What do you believe? What don't you believe? And I want to take off on this fat part. There's a social psychologist who did really most interesting kind of work. If you've read any of Michael Pollan's books, Michael Pollan does homage to this guy all the time. His name's Paul Rosen. And the title of his book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, comes from a paper that Paul Rosen wrote when Michael Pollan was a kid, I think, probably, But he was interested in how different foods become toxic to us, how we come to view them as toxic. And so he asked this question in a survey that was tied in with broader studies. He said, imagine that you're going to a tropical island and you can take only one food with you. Of these foods, which food would you take? And what he's doing is trying to get a sense of how people view different foods. So here's what people said. Going to that island, 42% said that they'd take bananas, 27% spinach, and so forth and so on. The key point, though, is the two foods that would get you down the road the furthest, that would be the best foods you could eat, are the two foods nobody wanted to take, right? Hot dogs and high fat kind of chocolate milk. Those are the two foods that would do you the best. And his whole point was, this is illustrating, and he's making this broader argument. Fat in the American culture in particular has become toxic. Not in the French culture, not in some of these others, and they don't suffer any more cardiovascular. In fact, it's less there. So he's making these broader points. But he said fat has become toxic. And if you go in the stores and try to buy full fat foods, you realize how toxic fat has become in this culture, right? It's hard to find that. Everything is low fat this, low fat that. And yet now you can really make the arguments that of the value of fat, and it's really equivocal in my mind, even relative to saturated fat. So let me just say a couple of words here to illustrate that point. Experience influences what we can perceive, how we believe, and how we behave. This idea, I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't believed it. So quickly on three things. First, it's clear, and we studied this forever with the animals, the diets that you learn in utero and early in life influence what you like, your preferences for foods. It's no different from human beings. And that's been shown with different foods, but with meat in this particular case here. You know, if you're used to eating grass-fed meat, odds are you're going to like that better than the grain-fed meat, especially if that meat starts to get some punch to it. A lot of times, my wife and I love to hunt, and we would eat deer and elk and those kind of things. But a lot of people, it was too gamey, right? They'd say it's too gamey. Well, that's acquired kind of preferences. Most Americans are born and raised eating grain-fed meat. So it can initially be off-putting to eat something that's finished on pasture. That's a first point. Another point that I find really fascinating, and again, I'm not trying to say everybody's unique. I realize that. There's some people, as Stefan points out, 2% of the population can probably live on a vegan diet. The rest probably can't because of how they're built and how their bodies function. So I'm not trying to say how people should eat, but I want to point out that there's some studies going on that you know, while vegetarians report a lower desire to eat meat for a variety of reasons, whether it's animal welfare or CAFO systems or so forth, compared with omnivores, their neural activity, when you look at neural kind of activity, reveals an inherent craving for meat. Their body is wanting what meat has and can offer to them. And to me, these findings highlight the dissonance between acquired beliefs and attitudes and inherent needs for nutrients that are contained. The cognitive rational analytical can override the synthetic, non-cognitive, synthetic intuitive part that has to do with what the body really needs. That's where we really get conflicted a lot. And how much of us then turn inward and say, well, what is my body really telling me? And I'm going to follow that. That's what I'm going to follow. That's kind of a main message that comes to me. And so you can see that, and the studies are amazingly interesting. Meat samples, they'll offer people exactly the same meat, but they'll tell them, you know, well, this came from a CAFO operation. The animals weren't treated well. They're fed high-grain diets. And the liking for that food goes way down if you tell them, oh, it came from this really great North Dakota farm that these people were producing this great food. The liking goes up, and it's the same piece of meat, you know. It's amazing to see the power of that. And I'm not saying I'm any different, but it's amazing. Same with gluten, and this isn't to say that some people aren't really sensitive to gluten, but some of the studies they run where they offer people food that doesn't even have gluten in it, and they tell them it has gluten, and they get sick, right? It's the power of what you believe to influence that. And it's happening, and there's a lot more studies in what I'm saying, but it's happening at a physiological level. You say, well, it's all in your head. Sure, of course, all this stuff, it's mediated by neuropeptides, hormones, neurotransmitters, and so forth. Ghrelin is one of these, the hunger hormone. It affects appetite, plays a key role in rate of use and distribution of energy in the body. But what's really interesting, this study, they would give people a chocolate milkshake, and they would tell them, in one group, they'd say, well, this is an 80-calorie, a really low-calorie milkshake. And their body would respond physiologically as if it was. On the other hand, if they tell, this is a 10,000-calorie milkshake, their body would respond as if it is. Does it make sense? Physiologically, all this stuff's real. It's happening, and it's the power of what we believe in, all that. So the point is, the wisdom of the body can be overridden by what we come to believe, and the unending advice, this conflicting advice, I think really makes things confusing. And so as we delve more and more into this, and I think it's important, we learn a lot that's valuable. But the point I'm trying to make is, who stops to say, and I don't read this in the human nutrition or any, that there's a wisdom to your body that if you trust that, and if you eat wholesome foods, it'll tell you, and it's subtle. I just try to pay attention to myself. Well, what sounds good today? You know, what sounds good today? And my wife sometimes will get on me, eat your banana today. I don't want a banana today. Eat your banana today. You need your potassium. And that's kind of defying everything I believe in. One, I don't believe in single nutrients. Two, my body doesn't want a banana today. But maybe in 2 days, I'll really want a banana. And you just watch this. You know, it's subtle. I think it's subtle. Unless you really start to get deficient, then you really kicks in. But I trust in that. And I think, you know, eat wholesome foods and just believe in your own body is what I think. And books like this, Mindless Eating, are just, it's hilarious to read how easily that wisdom of the body gets overridden. So, you know, it starts at where we grow your own food. If you purchase stuff, think about where you're getting it, exposing body to wholesome foods, and let the body do that in however you do it. So let me come back to that food for thought, and that'll be, I'll end on that one. So he was, Frank Meyer was saying, you know, keep these small herds in mind. They're important to us in our hunting. In fact, they form the basis of our attack. And this winds back to this whole social, cultural part of things. So he says, at the head of each of these little herds would be its leader, but the leader wasn't a courageous old bull ready and willing to whip the universe. It wasn't a bull at all. It was a cow, a sagacious old cow who by the power of her intellect had made herself a leader. Buffalo society, you see, was a matriarchy, and the cow was queen. They were matriarchies, huh? So you'd have from the offspring to the mother to the grandmother to the great-grandmother, and you'd have the young bulls in there. As the bulls age, they go off and form bachelor groups, but there's still, you know, there's these extended families are really and that's what the little groups were. So he says, wherever she went, the others went, including the big bulls, who should have known better than to follow a woman. And I swear he said that. I'm not making that up. Just so, back in those days, they weren't worried about it. When she stampeded, they stampeded. When she got into trouble, they didn't know what to do. Our job as runners was to get her in trouble as soon as we could. The rest was easy. So it was a really routine. And he said, we didn't make a lot of money. We worked our tails off. Each day, first thing in the morning, I would, from the day before, have identified a family. I would have identified who the matriarch was. And first thing you would do is shoot the matriarch, but you wouldn't kill her. You'd wound her so that she couldn't run off, and the others would not leave her. They would stay right there with her. So then you'd shoot the other ones. Then the skinners would come. They'd do their job of skinning. You'd go look for the next family for the next day. So he said it was a lot of hard work. We got involved in a lot of neat work with bison and extended families in bison. We were working with a guy named Bob Jackson who lives in Iowa and who runs about 300, 400 bison in extended families as part of his operation. But this video I want to show you, we were in Yellowstone National Park with Bob Jackson, and he was, you know, he'd spent a lifetime, 30 years, in the most remote part of Yellowstone National Park as a backcountry ranger. And the stories he's got about living back there for months at a time, all alone in those backwoods, about apprehending poachers, about it, just story after story. It's really, he's a fascinating guy, but his knowledge of bison was amazing. So we were in Yellowstone, and he was trying to help us to get up to speed on studies we were wanting to do and helping us to understand. But to me, we were there in Hayden Valley along the Yellowstone River, and we spent a half a day, and we were just watching, and there were a whole bunch of bison down there in this bottom. And he said, now you watch. Over this half day, when these bison get up and start to move, they're not going to get up as one big herd. They're going to do just what Frank Meyer was talking about. They're going to get up in these little groups, and they're going to go in different directions. And he said, you know, and some groups might follow other groups. He was talking about satellite groups and so forth. You know, once those groups get big enough, they will break off into satellite groups. And so I'm just going to show you that as a way to conclude here. Beautiful, huh? So this whole idea then of social organization and culture, and you can find it across all these different creatures, whether, on a riverbank, the cetaceans, amazing what's learned about their movements in the sea and the importance of social organization and culture. Bears in India, in Africa. The elephants, so much work has been done, and showing how poaching nowadays and what's happening in those national parks is breaking down those extended families and those knowledge bases, and how dysfunctional a lot of those systems are becoming as a result of that. The zebras, of course the primates, tons of work been done on primates. Not so much work done on kangaroos and cats nowadays, but and then there's somewhere near Walmart, huh? So the question I leave you with is this one. What price are we paying, what price do we pay when we break transgenerational linkages to these social and biophysical environments that we have for ourselves and for the animals in our care? And with that, I thank you very much for the chance to be here with all of you folks the last couple of days and throughout the day today. And I'll turn it over because I know I went a little bit long, so better go. Thank you.